Join me as we set out from Cork City to visit one of Ireland's most Instagrammable sites, that is Gougane Barra. You probably recognise the building behind me there. So this Gougane Barra is at the source of the Lee. Cork City is pretty much where the Lee enters the sea. There's Cork Harbour there, one of the biggest natural harbours in the world, and it's about 70 kilometres between the two. We're going to be doing a slightly longer distance than that because I'm going to be visiting some of the historical Republican sites from the period of the War of Independence, or the Tan War as it's sometimes called. So that's 1919, 1920, 21. There are several of those along the Lee Valley because it was one of the major sites of struggle. We're also going to be looking at some older monuments and at what was once one of the biggest gunpowder mills in either Ireland or Britain. It's actually quite a trip on the way up and back because I'm going to be doing it in one day, 155 kilometres in all. However, you can also do it in more than one day. You could do it over a couple of days there and back, or you could possibly just do this one direction and then head on to Kenmare. At the top of it, you're quite close to Kenmare. So as I go along, I'm going to be pointing out some alternate routes if you wanted to visit some of these sites as we go. The there and back route worked in terms of how I did it, but you may find, depending on your own plans, short diversions will still get you to every place I'm going to visit today. Anyway, let's get on the road. I'm not too sure what the traffic's going to be like getting out of Cork. I think I have a route plotted that should be okay. But we'll see. I'll be following the Lee almost all the way, although not right beside it, because generally there isn't a road right beside it. But yeah, let's see how we get on. Now, in fact, the first 5 or so kilometres is on cycle paths or on cycleways beside the river. We cross over it, and that is pretty pleasant cycling. You could do it as a short trip in itself. Here's the first error of the day. I crossed this bridge. That's not actually the correct route. It's a gate just a little bit beyond it, but it did give me a nice early morning shot of the rising sun. But what you're doing properly is you're coming through this very narrow path that's going along the Lee and then crossing over the Lee. And that's crossing over to the area that's known as Lee Fields. The Lee basically splits as it gets to Cork City, just here, and goes on either side of the centre of the city. This used to confuse me a lot when I visited Cork and had never looked at a map, because you'd head off in one direction from the river and then you'd be up the river again. Never quite understood how that happens. So this is part of what was the old floodplain of the River Lee, and it's where the university sports fields are. It also got flooded quite badly in 2009, I think, because there were 2 reservoirs on the Lee further up that are used by the ESB to generate electricity, and there was a problem basically with a lot of rainfall falling upriver, and they were worried about that creating flooding, so they opened the gates and allowed quite a lot of water down, caused a huge amount of damage. Although when you read the accounts of it, the damage to the university buildings, you are partially thinking, well, perhaps building on a floodplain wasn't the best of ideas, lads. That was the sort of thing you're exactly not meant to do. Anyway, a lot of the floodplain is a path. You're then coming out onto this very long straight road, which at one point in time was actually called the Straight Road, and this used to be used for motorbike races. There's actually a cycle path. This footpath I'm cycling on is a designated cycle path as well, so that gets you off that very busy straight main road for quite a while, and that brings you up to this roundabout. There's then a sort of segregated cycle path on the other side of the roundabout, and then the way I did it was I ended up doing this big loop around the roundabout. You could also cross over, and there was a cycle path again on this side of the road. And now we're turning off the cycle path again for the area around Ballincollig, and in particular the gunpowder mills of Ballincollig. So the gunpowder mills here were opened in 1794 by a Cork businessman called Charles Henry Leslie. He built a weir to produce a head of water and a canal that was about 1.5 miles long, so that's 2 kilometres, which was fed by the River Lee and which powered the 2 mills which are at the eastern end of the site. For the first 20 years following their construction, the mills were the largest in Ireland and the second largest in Europe after Waltham Abbey. Well, so far this has been pretty pleasant. There's a couple of sections on the road that have somewhat inadequate cycle paths, and that roundabout Back there is very confusing. The trick is to stay on the path to go around it. But apart from that, it's all pretty enjoyable so far. I think I have done about 10 kilometres and we have about 130 to go. 11 years later, the mills were bought by the British in the run-up to the Napoleonic War. The mill site was expanded tenfold and 12 new mills were added to the complex, as well as new processing buildings and the barracks, which was built to protect the supply of gunpowder. At this point, it's one of the largest gunpowder mills in Britain and Ireland. It's covering 435 acres and was enclosed by a high limestone wall. I presume the wall I was cycling past earlier was part of that. Then in 1830, the mills are acquired by John Tobin and the Company of Liverpool for £15,000. They transformed the mills into one of the most up-to-date industries in the country. And by 1837, they're employing several hundred workers. And by 1880, Ballincollig is one of the largest industrial establishments in Cork, with the mill employing many people in the area. The mills returned to private ownership for a while in the mid-19th century before closing permanently in 1903. Here we're going to cross onto the north side of the Lee again to intersect the Inniscarra Road, and I stop for the first break of the day at a handy petrol station with a toilet. Quick stop at the petrol station there, which is just 50 metres off the route, for coffee and chicken and stuffing sandwich for breakfast, which reminds me of how shockingly expensive Ireland is in comparison with Spain. I was like 9-10. I'd have expected a full meal. Any of you who've been following my Spanish travel diaries will know that I've just posted one where I had a meal of hake, chips and salad with a full bottle of white wine for $7.50. So quite a contrast. Good opportunity there, by the way, to follow the channel if you're not doing so already. I've loads of videos up for you to have a look at. Anyway, apologies for the quality of this section. I film using a GoPro 11 that is mounted on my handlebars, and something weird happened with it in this section where the stabilization stopped working. I have tried to add stabilization in my editor, and that has actually helped quite a lot, but as you can see, it's still very, very jerky footage. However, the good news is that this is part of the route that I had to double back on my way back, so I cover exactly the same route coming back, and you'll be able to have a look at it without all the nasty shakiness going on. This is a little farm road basically that's running off the main road, but in this section we're sort of skipping past the Inniscarra Dam, which is on the Lee itself. I'm curious about how possible it is to do a route that is on the south side, because I will be crossing over to the south side of the Lee again shortly. And in fact, if I do this cycle again, I very likely am going to do that. So we're now approaching the village of Dripsey, which is over the River Dripsey, one of the main tributaries to the Lee. And that's the site of one of the first memorials we're going to stop and have a look at, which is the Dripsey Ambush Memorial. So this is where a local unit of the IRA who were gathering to ambush British troops, but were unaware that they had been informed on. So they were raided just as they were meeting up to do the ambush. There was an exchange of gunfire, and the ones who were arrested on the site were jailed and sentenced to death. 2 civilians were also arrested, but they weren't actually sentenced on it. So this here is the River Dripsey that we're crossing. So they were executed, and in order to try and head off their execution, another IRA unit had taken the informer and an accomplice hostage, and when the IRA unit were executed, I think in 1921, you can read the plaques here, though I put them up, that informer and the helper were also executed at the same time. So a kind of illustration perhaps of the often quite brutal nature of the war against the British presence in Ireland in 1919, 1920 and 1921 in this particular roadside memorial. And as I said, we're going to be passing a few of these as we go through. This wasn't part of my original plan. They were literally all ones that I was just cycling past and I went, oh, there's something there, I'd stop and have a look at it, and then I would look up the story behind each in the aftermath. So that ambush happened during the War of Independence, which the British eventually were forced to admit defeat, came to a deal where they pulled out, but a lot of Republicans were not happy with the deal that was reached, so there was then the civil war between the pro and the anti-treaty forces. And so the next monument we're coming across, and it's really only a couple of kilometres down the road, was related to a killing during the Civil War. In this case, the new government forces that were called the Free State intercepted an IRA man who was called Tig Kennefic. He was 29-year-old, he was a captain, and he was on his way to his mother's funeral. They beat him with the butts of their rifles, and then he was shot and killed. And that's been compared by some historians to one of the worst atrocities of this period. Roadside killings, unfortunately, were not unusual, but some have compared it to not as bad, but comparable with the killings at Ballincollig in Kerry, which is when Free State troops tied anti-treaty IRA men to a landmine and detonated it by shooting at it. If you don't know much about that period of Irish history, but you'd like to know a bit more, I'd recommend the Ken Loach film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which covers both the War of Independence and then the treaty, the war between the pro and anti-treaty sides in the aftermath during the Civil War. It's quite an excellent film with a good lean, that is, towards the trade unions of the time, which is often a bit left out in the story. So this next bit is a memorial stone to the location of a soup kitchen that was there during the Irish famine of 1845, and that perhaps the proximity of the famine to the War of Independence and the Civil War, after all, it was only 70 years later, perhaps explains in part some of the brutality that happened, because these people would have heard their grandparents talking about the starvation of that time when 1 million died and another 1 million emigrated. Now, you'll notice there we have crossed the Lee again, so we are now on the south side of the river, but we're taking quite a big wide skirt around it, and that's because we are now getting to the area that is known as the Gearagh, properly that's running south of Macroom, and that's the point at which the River Lee descends from the mountains and widens into a broad alluvial floodplain. And so this was an area that was quite boggy, but also was a very, very ancient oak forest, some of the last surviving full oak forest trees in Western Europe, in fact, until the 1950s, when to facilitate the building of 2 hydroelectric dams on the Lee, the oak forest was largely cut down, so you can still see the waterlogged stumps in part of the water. You can also see submerged houses from the area around 2 Mile Bridge. Many of those trees were centuries old, and they'd been growing since the medieval period. Now, because the Gearagh was this kind of swampy oak forest, it was very secluded, it was little fragments, and it was very maze-like, which meant it was very hard for local guards to police it. It's an entertainingly bit of rough road here. I've had a quick look at the map, and it joins up with another road in about 1 kilometre, so it's probably okay. I'm just nervous after my experiences in Spain. But yeah, hopefully this time I don't end up pushing it through 10 kilometres of muddy forest. And it was a haven for pochine makers. So pochine is kind of homemade, I guess it's a kind of homemade vodka, basically, that's normally made from potatoes, but it can be made from anything at hand. And this area was renowned for the particularly high quality and potent brand that was being produced. I stopped to take off my jacket, and of course 2 minutes later it starts raining. And there's no rain forecast for today. I think it's a very, very light shower, and hopefully brief. I'm about 40-something kilometres in, so not so far to go now. Well over the halfway mark. Roads have got very bumpy, but not passable. Now, to be honest, multiple areas of rural Ireland would make that particular claim. I haven't drank enough of it to evaluate it. Never believe the weather forecast. It's not meant to be any rain at all today. And yet, here I am. And the last thing to say about it is that local folklore associated the area with a mischievous spirit called a Miskin Mahach that would deliberately confuse and lead visitors astray. And indeed, if you look up the National Folklore Archive, and if you've never done that, I thoroughly recommend it. It's basically folklore stories recorded from all over the country, mostly by school children in the 1920s. Here we jump back to history with these stones marking where the Battle of Deshure took place. So this is 1822. The Whiteboys were a secret organisation that defended tenants against landlords. They tried to raid the house of a landlord and tithe collector in January. That was an ambush. They were waiting for them. There were 5 men killed. They then assembled a bit later in the month to have a second go, but this time the yeomanry had been summoned. There were over a dozen of them arrested, and 4 of them were hung near the spot where those plaques are found by the roadside. Again, Irish history and the various struggles that made up the century before the War of Independence definitely contributed to the nature of that war. So those various memorials so far were just coincidental places that I was passing and stopped to have a look at. However, this next one was very deliberate, and it's the site of the famous IRA ambush of the auxiliaries at Kilmichael in 1920, when 36 local IRA volunteers commanded by Tom Barry killed 16 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary's Auxiliary Division. Now, those are actually former commissioned officers in the British Army, and quite similar to the Black and Tans, who'd committed many atrocities in that period. This all happened just a week after the IRA had killed British intelligence officers in Dublin on what became known as Bloody Sunday, and auxiliaries after that had driven into Croke Park and opened fire on the crowd, killing 14 civilians, 13 spectators and 1 player. The auxiliaries in Cork were based in nearby Macroom, so nearby to here, and they'd been raiding villages in this month. So on the 27th of November, an IRA column took up positions on the rocky hills on either side of the road, waited for the auxiliaries and opened fire on the trucks when they arrived. The first truck were wiped out. The second truck said they were going to surrender, but when the IRA men emerged to take the surrender, the auxiliaries opened fire on them, killing at least 1. So then all the IRA members present started firing at them, and they all were killed, except 1 who was just very severely injured and was thought to have been killed. And in the aftermath of that, martial law is declared across much of Munster, and the following day, on the 11th of December, British forces burnt down a significant part of Cork town in retaliation. You'll have noticed at this point the landscape has changed quite drastically. It's now quite steep hills, so we're going up and down a lot. There are lakes hereby, and we're approaching the village or small town of Gearagh, which has a string of paternoster lakes, collectively known as Loch Alula, nearby. Now, that used to be massively popular with anglers. And a lot of people used to go there on holidays, but that's before the dams were built. So basically the dams resulted in a sharp decline of fishing, coinciding with the loss of salmon on the River Lee. Inchigeelagh was also the meeting point for the La Company of the Irish Volunteers in April 1916, from where they intended to collect some of the rifles that Roger Casement had been landing at Bannostrand on board the ship Ord, but unfortunately Casement had been intercepted by the British, taken to London, put on trial for treason, and was then executed. One of the things I like about cycle touring is the way you are immersed in the landscape and the history. If I'd been in a car, I might not have even noticed most of these various monuments I'd have passed. But on a bicycle, you can't help but notice them. And you also have the advantage that you can just pull in and stop and take a better look. There are a number of spots along the route where you could definitely do a dusk to dawn camp. I haven't been focusing in on those because for this trip I had to get there and back in a single day, 154 kilometres round trip by the end of it, because I was looking after a kitten. Anyway, as you'll notice, we are now on a busier road, which is the regional road running to Bantry. We've crossed the Lee again, so we're again on the north side. Back at the milk churns, however, you could have gone straight and stayed on the south side of the river, and on the way back, that's the route I'm going to take, so you'll be able to see what that route looks like at that point. It has the disadvantage of being a lot hillier and also longer, but there are also some camping spots on that side of the lake. So again, I'll show you that on the way back because that's the way I came back. We are now heading for the village of Ballincollig, which is located in the Muskerry Gaeltacht. Gaeltacht, for those of you not from Ireland, is an Irish-speaking area. And according to the 2016 census, about 42% of the population there spoke Irish on a daily basis, and 89% of those over the age of 3 spoke Irish. So that's actually one of the highest rates in the country, so it's a relatively successful Gaeltacht. Leaving the village, we crossed the Lee for the final time, and now we're heading on the south side again up towards Gougane Barra itself. So, Gougane Barra means the rock cleft of Barra, and you might wonder who Barra is. Well, the answer to that is he's a Saint Finbar, who was around in the 6th and the 7th century, apparently, and who spent a while on the lake, basically living in isolation. So this is the early Christian period in Ireland, when following on from the kind of monks who sat on top of pedestals in the Syrian desert, you had monks in Ireland who sought out places of isolation, most famously the Skellig Islands, and basically their religious practice was to go there. So the early version of Finbar seems to have been a similar character coming to this lake because of its isolation, and when he was there, he then battled, I guess would be the word, a monster who was said to live in the lake, and the monster became a huge serpent, and when its body fell on the lake and fell on the land beyond the lake, that formed the River Lee running all the way down to Cork. And part of the deal in terms of battling the monster was that Finbar had to agree to build a cathedral at the point that the Lee then entered the sea. So that's why St. Finbar's Cathedral is found in Cork City. Now, there isn't even anything vaguely resembling a historical record from Ireland from back in the 7th century, so we don't really know how much of this is true. What we do know is this structure, which is the most famous one at Gougane Barra, is 19th century, so that's really quite recent. However, there is also a 17th century hermitage ruin, which is the bit where the Stations of the Cross are performed. So that definitely seems to be older. The other thing we do have is an absolutely fascinating record left by an English traveller in 1822 of the ceremonies that were going on that little bit of island back when he visited. So let me share with you the observations Thomas Crofton Crooker left us in his 1822 book, Researches in the South of Ireland. You can read that on Google Books, by the way. So he's really shocked by things, basically. He's shocked by drunken men and the most depraved of women, side by side, who are in an uproar of prayers and oaths of sanctity and blasphemy. And a lot of observers, when they're talking about Irish patterns, will divide things into what happens during the day, which is the religious aspect, the praying aspect, and what happens at night, which is this scene of complete bedlam. However, that's not really the way Croker saw it. Now, he was there on St. John's Eve, so St. John's Eve is near the summer solstice. It's celebrated in the south of Ireland. And by the south there, I don't mean the Republic, I mean Munster, basically, and also in Spain, and it's celebrated by lighting bonfires on hills, and it seems to be an older remnant of a pagan celebration, perhaps related to sun worship, for lack of a better term. So this seems to be what he's describing. He says there's chaos, intoxication becomes almost universal in these drinking tents that are set up all around Gougane Barra, that there's pipers, there's rebellious songs, there's the amusement of the lower orders of Irish are immoderate immediately attached. And then there's these bonfires in the hills all around him. And I'm kind of fascinated by his account because to me it feels very much like the racist horror writer H.P. Lovecraft writing about New England and, you know, his fears about indigenous people there and various migrant groups that have arrived, and he's seeing monsters everywhere. You know, this seems to be a very, very similar account of things, but it is an account we have from what was happening on this site in 1822. So I think it has some value, but one of the things I noticed on the way out was this house that had standing stones outside it, and then we come down to yet another of these Republican commemorations, and not quite the last one of this journey. So this is the spot the young IRA volunteer Christopher Lucy was shot from, across the valley. That's marked by the other cross. Basically an auxiliary sniper spotted him and shot him. That sniper then boasted about it in a pub in Macroom. The barman passed his name on to the IRA, and they later caught him and executed him in Cork City. So now we're on the return journey, but we're taking a different route. We're going down the south side of this lake, and we're going to stop at this Clapper Bridge, which is crossing the River Lee. Now, I'd have to say this was my favourite spontaneous find of the entire trip. I was just cycling past, spotted it, and stopped to have a closer look. And again, if you'd been driving, you might well not have even noticed it. And even if you had, there's not really much of a parking place there. It looks like you're pulling into the parking place of the house across the road. But how long has that actually been there for? You know, they said on the signage that it's marked on an Ordnance Survey map of 1831. But of course, it could have been there much, much, much longer. I mean, hundreds of years, thousands of years? I don't know. It has a great sense of mystery to it. It also made me think it would be fun to go and seek out all the other clapper bridges that exist around the country. Apparently 6 of them on the Lee at all. Anyway, we're now on the south side of the lake, and as you can see, this side is much hillier, much rougher, but the road is very much quieter. There's very little traffic whatsoever on it, so it makes for much pleasanter cycling that way. So if you were doing the one-way trip, perhaps this south side of the lake is the way to come up to Gougane Barra and avoid a chunk of traffic in doing so. It also has the advantage that, as we'll see in a moment here, there is a spot where people are obviously camping alongside the lake. That's probably a fairly long-running tradition there, so it would be a good place to stop off if you are going to do an overnight stop coming out of the city of Cork. Those are people camping in there, for instance, and there's another batch of them along here. That bit is probably only 10 kilometres from Gougane Barra, so you could camp there, get up early, and be in Gougane Barra for soon after sunrise the next morning. I suspect the valley would be spectacular there. You're not meant to camp in Gougane Barra itself, obviously, nor in the Quilcha Wood beyond it. Probably get away with it in the Quilcha Wood, I think. Also, that laneway that I pulled down beside the lake, there's a bit of land at the end of it, but certainly that lakeside option is probably is one that's obviously socially acceptable. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but where there's an established tradition of people camping, generally that's the sort of place I prefer to stop. The road itself, as we can see, is rough. These are L-class roads in Ireland. They're distinct from the regional or national roads, but here we're coming back onto the national road, back at the village, and again we're taking a different route back. So here we're going down the north side of the lake, whereas previously we'd gone up the south side. I purely did this for variation, and to be honest, although this had the benefit of me being tired, I had second thoughts here. This was an offshoot that my navigation was sending me up, and I went, yeah, that's a little bit too rough for me. yeah, at this point I was quite tired and I wanted to get back to Cork as quickly as possible. So the idea of a long straight road with a good surface on it was quite attractive, even if that also had the reality of having a lot more traffic on it. I think if you were not pushed for time, this would not be the way to go. This is a Sunday afternoon, if I remember correctly, so you'd have relatively light traffic, and compared with other times of the day, I'd say it could probably be very unpleasant anywhere near rush hour on a working day. You could have a lot of very fast moving traffic, and even here there were bits where there was just, it was a little bit too much, a little bit too intense, and I didn't really enjoy it. So it's an option for you, but I think if you're watching the video, then coming up the other side makes more sense. So we've just crossed Toon Bridge there, and this section into the right is the Gearagh Nature Reserve. So that's the last remnant of that ancient oak forest that was mostly flooded by the reservoir that I talked about earlier. And then in on the left-hand side, and we're going to touch the very edges of it, is the town of Macroom, which is, that's kind of the biggest regional town in the area. So you're basically on this road. As you can see, there's a lot of traffic. That's because it's heading for Macroom, and then we're going to go onto the Macroom bypass as we get nearer to Macroom itself. Yeah, this is where we are now, on the edge of it. We're swinging around, coming down, and that's the bypass there that we're now going under, and we're heading down for the next town on the route, which is Coachford. So again, this road between Coachford and Macroom is again still pretty busy, and as I said, Sunday afternoon, it's not too bad, but I suspect it could be pretty nasty if you were rush out on a weekday. So probably to be avoided. Stay on the south of the lake where you'd have nice quiet roads all the way up, and probably skip that crossing I did on the way up myself if you're doing it as a one-way trip and you don't want any variation in the cycling. So we're just getting to Carrigadrohid here, which, apart from a minor role in 1916, is probably more infamous for a very Game of Thrones type scene during the Cromwellian War, when the Cromwellian forces hung the local bishop by his own horse's reins outside the castle, which is just south of the village in the middle of the river, in order to try and compel them to surrender. So here I just stopped there at that particular point. There's a few little fishing spots that are just off the road, and I was checking that one out to see if it might be somewhere where you could also camp overnight. The answer is yes, I think it probably would be. So that's another option if you're looking for some dusk to dawn camping as you're coming up this road. And now we're heading for Coachford, which is the last of the newish, is that the right word? Villages that we're going through, i.e. that we didn't also go through on the way up. Coachford is one of those that does what it says in the tin town names. It's basically the location of a ford that the coaches used to cross, horse-drawn coaches, and apparently the stream they were crossing still runs under the centre of the village here. It was also the home of those two informers we talked about in relation to the Dripsey ambush, which was Mrs. Mary Lindsay of Leamont House, an elderly widow, and her driver James Clark, who, after failing to persuade the IRA against the ambush, informed the Brits, and then when the British executed the 6 people involved in the ambush, the IRA executed the 2 informers in retaliation. So this gets us back onto the route we'd already travelled, which is the one down by Dripsey. We're coming back up, and this is the bit that I had the problems with the camera earlier, where the vibrations were far too intense to actually watch. So this will give you an opportunity to see this road in a more reasonable manner, let us say. So, yeah, this is the turn up here where it turns up into the more rural road that runs above the main road. Otherwise, this is the regional road to Cork. So, although there are now bigger national roads built, it still carries a lot of traffic. So on the way back, again, I decided I was going to come back as far as possible on a different route than I had on the way down. This is one of the few exceptions. But once we get to that filling station that I'd stopped for my breakfast in the morning, I'm going to stay on this north side of the river. So staying on this regional road. Again, as you can see, it's got a fair amount of traffic on it for a Sunday afternoon. That just got more intense as I got closer to Cork City itself. And I am eventually going to, in fact, turn across the bridge at Ballincollig. So here we are at the the petrol station, and then heading down on this. I hope you've been enjoying this video so far. If you have, do give it a thumbs up. If you have, give it a thumbs up to get it out to more people. I didn't intend it to be quite so much of what Alan Partridge might have called a recruiting ad for the IRA, if you've seen that classic episode. But that's Irish history. I mean, you know, there's no real getting away from it. There's periods of quite intense brutality under colonial occupation and resistance to it, and here we are at our final marker of that, which is yet another Civil War one. Here we cross the Lee once again to come back onto that roundabout between Lee Fields and Ballincollig. So cycling down that footpath that, as I said, is also a cycle route map, and then into that long park that's running alongside Lee Fields, playing this at a very fast rate because you've seen all of this already coming up the other way, back down by the university and its playing fields, and then heading back down through the kind of narrow pathway that runs once more, and I think for the final time, across the Lee. So give me a follow on Instagram if you want to see these trips live as I do them. I'm eBike Touring Life over there, and if you haven't done already, do subscribe to the channel, and please do leave a comment if you have any questions to ask, and read the description I have with this video, which, by the way, does include a link to the cycle travel route map I use, so you'll be able to follow my route exactly if you want to do the whole thing there and back in a single day, 154 kilometers. Don't know if I recommend that, but I would like to say I hope this encourages you to consider it, and if so, perhaps one day I shall see you on the road.